Good evening. You know what was just read a moment ago in Matthew chapter 22, verses 11 through 14, where we see a parable of a master who invites and wants to share a feast with others. He sends out the invites, and yet many did not want to come. We'll come back to that as we approach the end as far as what happened with this man that wasn't in his wedding clothes. But you know, there are, as we look at Jesus' life, there are many instances where Jesus dines with others. And I think He establishes for us the power of fellowship, the power of that being together and sharing a meal and talking to each other. I want us to look at several of these times that Jesus has dinner with someone. And I want us to see what lessons we can draw from them. We have two instances of Jesus having a meal with Mary and Martha, and that family that was so very close to Him. In Luke chapter 10 and verses 38 through 42, we see that memorable instance where Martha is working so hard to serve. She's working so hard to get the meal out and do everything that she feels like she needs to do for Jesus, and that's admirable. And Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet listening to Him teach. And Martha, I remember when I was growing up, my siblings and I were a lot like Martha. If I was having to do something, why is my sister not having to do something too, right? And so Martha comes out and goes, "Lord, make her come in here." I love Jesus' response to her, "Martha, Martha." I mean, you just almost kind of see Him shaking His head. You are so worried about so many things, but only one thing is important. And Mary has chosen that. You know, when you hear that only one thing is important, it kind of reminds me of the movie City Slickers, right? When they ask Curly about life, he says just one thing. And that really is, there's a lot of truth to that from a spiritual standpoint. That really in our lives we need to understand, we need to realize and remember that really only one thing matters in this life. And that is Jesus Christ. And that is a life that is lived for Him. You know, Jesus here is teaching as He is in this house with Mary and Martha. He's teaching proper priorities for us. We need to know what is most important. And in knowing what is most important, we can then distribute our time, our energy, and our resources accordingly. So oftentimes, because we don't exercise good priorities, we give so much time and energy to things that aren't important, that when it comes down to the important things, we have run out of time, or we're too tired, or it's just too hard at this moment. So we need to prioritize. We need to understand, as Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 23, as He gave those woes to the Pharisees, that they had forgotten that there were weightier matters. There were things of greater importance than what they were focusing on in their lives. Things like justice and mercy and faithfulness. Another time that we see, Jesus meeting with Mary and Martha is Matthew chapter 26 and verses 6 through 13. And what we see here is Martha doing what needed to be done. Not Martha, Mary, excuse me. Mary doing what needed to be done. But not only is she just doing what needed to be done in regard to anointing Jesus for His death, she believed Jesus regardless of how hard it was to believe what He said. Peter, John, the other disciples would always argue with Jesus when He talked about dying. It was something that they didn't want to hear. It was something they didn't want to believe. It was something that they seemed to refuse to accept. And yet here is Mary, just 7 days before His death, and she believes it. And she believes it enough to buy expensive perfume and to come and to prepare Him for His death there at that meal. It's a powerful moment, a moment that Jesus says in regard to Mary. He says, "For as long as the gospel is preached, you will remember her and what she has done for me this day." There are so many that refuse to accept what Jesus has said that they must do. So many people sometimes choose to reject or refuse to accept that they're going to have to do certain things if they want to be what Christ would have them to be. And yet they need to follow the example of Mary. They need to follow the example of Mary and do based on what He says and nothing else. I guess when we think about dining with Jesus, the one that's going to come to the forefront has to be the Last Supper. And we could spend literally weeks in John chapters 13 through 17 as we look at Jesus' last words there to these men. These very important last words as He's trying to prepare these men for what is going to be the darkest night and the darkest next day that they have ever known in their lives. And He's trying to impart important truths, and we certainly will not be able to cover all that is there. But I think one thing for us to note and for us to take hold of is that when Jesus walks into that upper room, when He walks in for this final supper, I mean, He knows exactly what is coming. He knows this is His last hours with these men. Can you imagine walking in and they are sitting there arguing about who is greatest? When Jesus walked in the room, that should have been a mute issue, right? They were being everything that Jesus was not. The one who came to serve, not to be served. The one who showed humility, though He was the creator of all things. And we know what He does there as He sees what they are doing, that He washes their feet to show them the humility that He had, that the creator of all the universe would get down on the floor, put a towel on, and wash dirty, nasty feet, that nothing was below what Jesus was willing to do in serving others. You know, we think to Luke chapter 14, and Jesus there talking about another meal situation, but He's talking about the fight for the seats. You know, the closer you were to the master of the table, the more prestigious the seat was. And people would be jockeying and trying to get to that seat. And Jesus says, you know, you need to go to the last seat. Well, that's the seat of least honor, right? Have you ever wondered where He might have been sitting when He told this? Because He said, what you'll do, you'll go up there and you'll sit in the seat of honor. And the master will come in and say, you need to get up. There's someone more important than you, right? Now you're embarrassed and the only thing left is the last seat. Because everybody else has got in the others. But you go to the last seat and you let the master come to you and go, move up and bring you up. See, there's a difference in promoting ourselves and letting God promote us. Letting God show how important we are. We need to be very careful that we don't get into this trap of trying to decide who is the greatest among us. Well, He also talked to them that night about keeping the devil away from your heart. One of the most heartbreaking episodes there in that upper room is Judas. Just about a year earlier is where we have the first recorded instance where Jesus addresses Judas in regard to the fact that someone among the 12 is going to betray Him. And now here we are a year later. Judas has already talked to the high priest. He's already found out what they would offer. The deal is pretty much done. And he's there sitting with Jesus. You know, Jesus says, whoever dips with me. And he says, Lord, is it I? He even ask Him, even though he knows. But it's been in his head. He's allowed himself to let it run around in his thoughts now. And then the Bible tells us that the devil entered his heart. And Jesus says, what you do quickly. And a chilling phrase as He leaves that upper room said, and as He went out, it was night. He had left the light and went out into the darkness of His betrayal. You know, you never need to let the devil anywhere near your heart. Never need to let him anywhere into your minds, because it had to begin as a thought process somewhere with Judas long before he ever did that terrible act. And he let him in, and as a result, the devil, when you really think about it, he's like a thief. And he's casing your house. He's casing your life. And he's waiting for that perfect moment where he can break in and steal your faith. And folks, he's good at what he does. His batting average is pretty good, considering all the people he's gotten, save the one he didn't. You need to make sure that you never let him anywhere near your thoughts. And then, we go back to the same thing that we saw with Mary, with Jesus there on that night. And that is to accept what Jesus says, no matter how hard it is to hear, no matter how hard it is to implement in our lives. Accept it because it's Him. Because He speaks only the truth. Jesus says, I'm going to die. Peter says, no, you're not. You're going to betray me. No, you're not. No, we're not, brother. Argued with him that whole night. And we're going to see that come back to Peter. Every time Jesus told Peter what was going to happen, Peter said, no, it's not. And yet everything that Jesus said happened within hours of saying it. Peter denied Him. The disciples left Him. They were scattered there in the Garden of Gethsemane. So we see these things at the Last Supper. I guess some of the largest meals Jesus had would be His feeding of the 5,000 and His feeding of the 4,000. Certainly the feeding of the 5,000 being what we sometimes term the miracle of miracles, because it is the only miracle Jesus performed that all four gospel accounts record. But we have Him feeding the 5,000, and in those moments of dinner with those people, we can see that Jesus provides everything we need. He provides for us physically. He provided for those people, especially when you look in John chapter 6 and the feeding of the 5,000. He provided for those people that day, just as Moses provided for the people with manna. And they even made reference to that. But not only does He provide for us physically, but more importantly, Jesus provides for us spiritually. And as you go into the last half of John chapter 6, you see that the people realize Jesus left overnight after feeding them. They follow to where they know He is. He's at Capernaum. He's in the synagogue. And they want Him to feed them again. But now He wants to provide them the things they truly need. And it's not fish and it's not bread anymore. It's the spiritual things. It's the bread come down from heaven. It's living water is what He wants to give to them. They're not as interested in that. In Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, blessed are those that hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Jesus gives us all that we could ever hope for and want in our spiritual lives. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 3 makes clear to us that every spiritual blessing, everyone, is found in Jesus Christ. So we see in His feeding of the 4,000, we see in His feeding of the 5,000 that Jesus is provider. He is sustainer. And He is nourisher. But another meal that we can consider is that breakfast. That breakfast by the Sea of Galilee. We're after His resurrection now in John chapter 21. And they're out fishing on the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus is there. And He's actually preparing the meal for them. And they realize it's Him finally. And I love Peter. I do. As much as he can mess up, Peter's the great example sometimes as well. Peter doesn't just wait till the boat gets into the shore. That's going to take too long. Peter jumps out of the boat and swims to the shore to get to Jesus. Remember I told you that Peter argued with Jesus that last night? No, Lord. No. Remember those questions that Jesus asked him on that seashore? Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I like you. Peter, do you love me? Yes. He tells him to feed his sheep, tend my lambs. But the third time that Jesus asked is really where we see that Peter has finally gotten it. Peter, do you love me? What was his response? Lord, you know all things. Thank you, Peter. If only you'd have had that mentality in the upper room, right? Lord, you know all things, and you know that I love you. So we see Jesus as the one that heals Peter there. Heals the hurt and the heartache of what he had done that night. And comes to him and makes it very clear to him, Peter, I still have a place for you. And folks, I don't care what you've done. I don't care how bad it is. I don't care how many sins you have committed. Jesus has a place for you. And He has a task for you to do for Him. If only you'll come to Him. Do you know, even as Peter comes out of that, and that's a very cathartic moment for Peter, but we instantly see the other side of Peter, right? When he's wondering what John knows now that he doesn't. And Jesus says, that's not your concern. You need to stay where I'm putting you and do those things that I want you to do. That chapter ends with a profound statement. That if all the things that Jesus did were written, that the world could not contain the books. Isn't that profound? You know, there are other times that we could examine that time won't allow us, but we could look at the meal with Zacchaeus. We could look at the time with Matthew. He has various meals with certain Pharisees. He has the meal where they tear through the roof and lower the lame man there in front of him as he is eating. But you know what I see in all of those things, when we think about all of those things, what we see is that Jesus was a social person, wasn't He? He was a person that found people to be important. And He wanted to spend time with them. And He wanted to visit with them and get to know them better, even though He is the one who knows all men, as He told us in the book of John. I'll give you an example. You know, Jeannie and I, we loved the 4 different times that we had meals with the elders and the ministers during the interview time. Wonderful times of fellowship and getting to know one another. But those times told us so much about the men we serve with as the elders and their wives. Told us so much about Doug and Chris that I knew I would be working with on a daily basis. Those times so impressed us that we just couldn't imagine at that point being anywhere else. Wouldn't it be great to have that kind of mealtime with Jesus? To be able to sit down and to break bread and to listen to Jesus speak and to be able to interact with Him. Oh, I wish I could do that. But can you imagine what we would learn? Can you imagine what you would find out about Him by sitting at His feet for a meal, listening to Him talk? I told you we would come back to the parable in Matthew 22. You know, the people were invited to the feast. They were invited to come, and in the parable we have this man. Of course, there's a large group that refused to come, and in fact they mistreat the servants, and he says, well, they're not worthy, and he invites others, right? And this man is there, and he doesn't have on his wedding garments. Sometimes we go, well, that's kind of odd. And, you know, cultural things sometimes are when we don't understand them, but the master provided the clothes to those that came. So you have a man here that has been provided clothes for the marriage feast, and he has refused to wear the clothes provided. Isn't that disrespectful to the master? Your clothes aren't good enough for me. And so he didn't get to share in the feast. He didn't get to be a part of the celebration. Instead, the Bible says that he was cast in a place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. He is one of those that was called but ultimately was not one of those that was chosen, as the parable ends. See, those clothes that man should have had on are the clothes of obedience. The Master has given us the clothes. We put on Christ. We put on what He wants us to be, and we become more like Him. But if I refuse to put on that which has been provided to me, to put it onto my life, then I have no more hope of being in the great feast one day, the great celebration we talked about this morning, than that man in that parable. This evening, I hope and pray that you know that you've been called. Will you put on Christ so that you can be truly chosen by Him? Jesus Christ came and He lived this wonderful life. He had all these examples that we're such as what we're looking at tonight of how He interacted with people. But all of that, His main goal was to seek and to save that which is lost. And that's still His goal today for you and for me. And so tonight, if you need to take hold of Christ in obedience, to put on those obedient clothes, we hope and pray that you will let us help you. In whatever way it may be, we want to. And Jesus wants you to this evening. Won't you come as we stand?
Let's rise up and build